In the shadows of the Asuka court, a forgotten daughter of Empress Suiko met a fate too cruel to be remembered. At just 19, she was condemned to be buried alive. No stone to mark her grave, no voice to mourn her name. History erased her. Yet the silence around her death lingers like a curse, whispering of power's merciless hunger. Born within the grandeur of the Asuka court, she should have been destined for recognition. Her name etched in records as the daughter of Japan's first reigning empress. Yet from the very beginning, her presence was treated as something inconvenient, an unspoken burden cloaked in silence. While her brothers and cousins were whispered about as potential heirs, her existence was noted only in fragments, and then, in time, not at all. She grew up in the shadows of polished corridors, her small figure trailing behind attendants who rarely bowed with sincerity. As a child, she witnessed the rituals of the imperial household, the solemn offerings at Buddhist temples, the elaborate ceremonies that blended Shinto traditions with the new faith, the intricate dance of political alliances unfolding within her mother's court. But while the Empress herself commanded reverence as a ruler, her daughter became a ghost within the palace, seen but unacknowledged. Children of imperial blood were rarely given a chance to live ordinary lives, but this young girl's fate was stranger still. She had the blood of power, yet was stripped of its recognition. No official titles were bestowed upon her, no formal rank granted. Among servants and courtiers, whispers swirled like hidden smoke. Some claimed she was born at an inconvenient moment, when factions were already pressing against Empress Suiko's fragile hold on authority. Others murmured that she had been deliberately concealed, her very existence a political liability in a court that balanced on the knife's edge of rival clans. To her, childhood was not measured in laughter or games, but in silences. She learned quickly to walk without sound, to bow without being asked, to retreat into corners where her presence would not trouble anyone. She became skilled at hiding her thoughts behind lowered eyes, at veiling her voice with softness, at letting others forget that she was there. Yet in her heart, the question grew heavier with every season. Why had she been born into light, only to be condemned to shadows? The palace itself reflected her isolation. The Asuka halls were bright with gold-leaf screens, painted with mountains and flowing rivers. But her chambers were austere, furnished only with what was necessary. Courtiers walked past without greeting, and even attendants seemed careful not to linger too long, as though her presence carried an invisible danger. A single slip of gossip could ruin a servant's career, and no one wished to be associated with a princess who was not truly allowed to be one. Despite this, the girl carried herself with quiet grace. She was often seen sitting beneath the plum blossoms in the palace gardens, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the falling petals. Perhaps she sensed, even then, that her life would not be long, that she was destined to be erased. Each petal that drifted to the earth seemed to mirror her own existence, fragile, brief, and easily brushed aside. But even shadows leave impressions. There were whispers among some younger servants who pitied her. They said she spoke rarely, but when she did, her words were marked with thoughtfulness, as though she saw more clearly than others what life within the court truly was. Perhaps it was her distance from the center of power that granted her this clarity. Perhaps it was because she had nothing to lose that she understood everything. Her childhood was not one of cruelty in the obvious sense. No whips, no hunger, no chains. Instead, it was the cruelty of silence, of being made invisible. And in many ways, that silence was worse. For a child born to the most powerful woman in the land, to grow up as though she did not exist, was itself a sentence, a quiet execution of identity. The world around her was alive with brilliance, even as she remained unseen. The Asuka period was an age of transformation, when the winds of Buddhism swept through Japan, reshaping not only temples and rituals, but the very foundation of governance. The court glittered with foreign embassies, monks from Baekje and Silla, and envoys bearing scriptures and icons that dazzled the imagination of the ruling elite. Within this vibrant exchange, Empress Suiko reigned, a figure of both tradition and innovation. Reforms whispered through the corridors of power. The adoption of the Chinese calendar, the construction of temples like Asuka Dera, the proclamation of new administrative titles, all signaled a society racing toward modernity. And yet, amidst this transformation, old customs of bloodline politics remained unshaken. Power was not held by one figure alone, but carefully balanced among great clans such as the Soga, Mononobe, and Nakatomi, each weaving marriage alliances like nets to capture influence. It was within this storm of ambition and faith that the young princess lived her quiet, erased life. She was both present and absent, a vessel of potential alliances who was never permitted to fulfill them. Her mother, the Empress, was praised for bringing stability. But the stability was fragile, resting on constant negotiation with rival clans. In such a world, even the presence of an unmarried imperial daughter could become dangerous. To the court, she was a pawn whose purpose lay in marriage. A daughter of imperial blood could unite factions, could secure loyalty, could silence rivals. But if the tides of politics shifted, she could also become useless, an abandoned piece swept off the board. This was the precarious balance of her existence. Outside the palace walls, life thrived in color. Farmers tended rice fields, artisans crafted intricate jewelry and pottery. Monks preached doctrines of compassion, and villagers carried stories of gods and spirits into every season. The Asuka world was not silent. It was vibrant, alive, filled with prayers and festivals. Yet within the palace, the princess lived like a shadow behind the golden screens, hearing laughter and music without ever being invited to join. It was a cruel irony. She lived at the very heart of the most dazzling court of the 7th century. Yet she might as well have been buried already. Each festival that passed, each decree that reshaped the realm, reminded her of how little she mattered to those who held power. And as she watched the splendor of Asuka unfold, she could not help but feel that she was already being erased, her life written in invisible ink. Her fate was not yet sealed, but the silence around her had already become a kind of sentence. The brilliance of Asuka, with all its temples and reforms, could not illuminate the darkness that grew within the heart of one forgotten daughter. Blood was both blessing and curse within the Asuka court. And for the young daughter of Empress Suiko, it became a chain heavier than iron. From the moment she came of age, her existence was not her own. She was defined by what her blood could purchase, what her lineage could secure, and what alliances her body might cement. To be born of an empress was not to inherit freedom. It was to be transformed into an emblem, a symbol of dynastic continuity, and a bargaining chip in the hands of ambitious families. The clans that surrounded the throne had no shortage of schemes, and every marriage was a transaction with implications far greater than affection. For this young princess, whose name would never be recorded, the weight of expectation was suffocating. Within the palace, whispers sharpened like blades. Courtiers remarked on her beauty, on the quiet dignity with which she carried herself, on the sharpness of her gaze that belied her youth. To them, she was a resource waiting to be claimed. A daughter of imperial blood who might unite the fractured loyalties of rival houses. Yet her very presence unsettled those who desired to consolidate power. The Soga clan, who dominated the court through their support of Buddhism, viewed her as a potential instrument, but also as a liability. If she were married into another powerful clan, she could upset the delicate balance of influence. The Mononobe and Nakatomi, who opposed the Soga, whispered that her lineage could be used as a banner against them. In the ruthless arithmetic of politics, she was a number to be added or subtracted, never a human being with a heart and dreams of her own. Her mother, the Empress, carried her own burdens. Empress Suiko had accepted the throne in an unprecedented act, the first woman in Japanese history to reign as sovereign. But her authority was never absolute. It was circumscribed by advisors, regents, and clan leaders who pulled the strings behind the throne. In such an environment, even a daughter could become a threat to stability. To protect the throne meant to sacrifice everything, even blood. The princess felt the contradiction in every step of her life. She was too noble to be forgotten entirely, but too dangerous to be fully acknowledged. She occupied a liminal space, caught between reverence and suspicion, utility and expendability. This fragile position ensured that she was constantly watched, her movements noted, her words weighed. A single gesture could be misinterpreted as ambition. A single friendship could be seen as conspiracy. At night, within the silent corridors of her chambers, she must have wrestled with these unseen chains. She had no allies strong enough to shield her, no path to carve her own destiny. The very blood that gave her the possibility of significance also painted a target upon her back. She lived in a paradox, necessary but unwanted, valuable but feared. It is perhaps this very paradox that sealed her fate. History has shown that courts often reserve their harshest punishments for those who are too visible to be ignored, but too vulnerable to be defended. For the daughter of Empress Suiko, her lineage was both her crown and her executioner. Every drop of imperial blood within her veins carried not promise, but peril. As she grew into adolescence, the fragile balance of her existence came into sharper focus. Her coming of age was marked not by celebration, but by negotiation. Whispers of betrothal spread through the court, each rumor attaching her to a different clan. At last, an agreement was struck. She was to be wed to a chieftain of great standing, a union that would strengthen bonds between the imperial household and a rising family whose loyalty was considered crucial. For a brief moment, it seemed as though her destiny had been decided. Attendants whispered of wedding robes being prepared, of ceremonial offerings being planned, of the possibility that she might finally step into recognition as a bride whose blood would tie clans together. Perhaps she even allowed herself to hope that this marriage would grant her a place in the world, a role that was more than silence and shadow. But the Asuka court was never still. Alliances shifted like sand underfoot, and the tide of fortune was cruelly swift. The chieftain who had been promised to her fell from favor as rival factions gained influence. The Soga pressed their dominance more firmly, while other clans maneuvered to undermine them. In such turbulence, her betrothal became irrelevant. The agreement was dissolved, whispered away, as though it had never been spoken. The shame was not hers, yet she bore the weight of it. To be promised and then abandoned marked her as undesirable, as if she were a failed commodity in the marketplace of politics. Courtiers looked upon her with thinly veiled disdain, whispering that the heavens themselves had rejected her. Attendants grew colder, less attentive, as though association with her might taint their own standing. The young princess, once prepared to step into the light of recognition, was thrust back into the shadows with even greater force. The discarded betrothal became a scar that she could not escape. Each time she walked through the palace corridors, she felt the eyes of others upon her, judging, mocking, pitying. The humiliation was not merely personal, it was political. In a court where every gesture carried meaning, her broken engagement was a declaration of her weakness. Yet beneath the weight of shame, there remained a quiet resilience. She endured the whispers, the glances, the laughter that followed behind her steps. She continued to walk with dignity, even as the ground seemed to dissolve beneath her feet. Perhaps she understood, even then, that her fate was being woven into something darker. That she was being prepared not for marriage, but for sacrifice. The Asuka court, in its brilliance, had no place for a young woman whose value had been stripped away by shifting alliances. In the eyes of power, she was no longer a bride, but a burden. And in a world where burdens were swiftly eliminated, her future grew increasingly uncertain. The Asuka court thrived on whispers, and whispers were often more powerful than proclamations. For the forgotten daughter of Empress Suiko, the loss of her betrothal did not merely mark her as undesirable, it painted her as vulnerable. And in a world where weakness was opportunity, her very existence became a tool for factions eager to wound one another. The great clans had long wielded rumor as a weapon sharper than any sword. Soon, malicious tales began to gather around her name. Some whispered that she harbored secret ambitions, that she dreamed of stepping beyond the shadows her mother had confined her to. Others claimed she had been conspiring with attendants, seeking allies among those who might help her seize influence. None of these accusations bore truth. But truth mattered little in the court. Perception was reality, and perception was easily manipulated. At 19, she was defenseless. She had no allies strong enough to speak for her, no father to protect her, and even her mother's power was fragile, stretched thin by the demands of balancing the rival clans. Empress Suiko, though sovereign, ruled under constant scrutiny. Her decisions weighed against the interests of the Soga and their opponents. To shield her daughter too openly might have invited suspicion, and suspicion could unravel the throne itself. Thus, the young princess stood alone. The factions saw opportunity. If she could be painted as a conspirator, her erasure would seem justified. If she could be accused of rebellion, her removal would appear necessary. In the shadows, rival courtiers whispered of her supposed arrogance, her dangerous beauty, her unspoken claim to a power that she never once sought. A single misplaced gesture, a single glance interpreted too boldly, was twisted into evidence. The Asuka court was not a place of justice, but of survival. In this labyrinth of ambition, the young princess became a pawn in games she could not even comprehend. To one clan, her presence was a threat that must be silenced. To another, she was a scapegoat upon whom blame could be cast. And in the middle of these schemes, she was stripped of humanity, reduced to nothing more than a symbol. Her days became filled with unease. Once ignored, she now found herself watched too closely. Attendants who had once treated her with indifference now spoke in hushed tones, careful with their words. Courtiers smiled too sharply, their courtesy lined with venom. She felt the shift in the air, as though the palace itself had turned against her. At night, in the solitude of her chambers, she may have clutched her robes tighter, sensing the gathering storm. There was no safe path, no gesture she could make to undo the whispers. Silence had once protected her, but now it condemned her. Every moment of quiet became fuel for accusation. Why did she not speak unless she was plotting in secret? Why did she walk alone unless she was meeting conspirators in the dark? The irony was cruel. Her entire life had been spent in invisibility, yet the very act of being unseen was now painted as dangerous. Invisibility became a mask, and the mask was reinterpreted as ambition. And thus, the shadows she had been forced into since childhood became the weapon used to destroy her. Her fate was sealed not by anything she had done, but by everything she represented. She was blood, she was potential, she was fear. And for that, the whispers in the Asuka court began to sharpen into something deadly. In the Asuka court, justice was not declared in open trials. Verdicts were whispered in corridors, sealed behind screens, delivered not with swords, but with silences. For the forgotten daughter of Empress Suiko, her sentence arrived in this most insidious form. Without hearing, without defense, without truth. The accusations, though baseless, had served their purpose. They spread like ink through water, staining everything they touched. By the time the whispers reached the ears of those who mattered, her innocence no longer existed. To the court, she was already guilty. Guilt in such a place required no evidence, only consensus. And consensus was built on fear. The decision came quietly. There was no formal proclamation, no inscribed document that bore her name. To inscribe her name would have been to acknowledge her, and acknowledgement was precisely what her enemies wished to deny. Instead, a secret order was passed, discreet and final. She was to die. Not swiftly, not with the ritual dignity afforded to nobles, but in silence, in erasure. Her execution was not to be by sword, nor by poison, nor by exile. Those punishments would have been visible, remembered, spoken of. Instead, she was condemned to the cruelest death imaginable, burial alive. To bury her was to erase her existence both physically and historically, to cast her into the earth as though she had never walked the palace corridors at all. For the court, this decision solved every problem. Her removal would appease rival clans who feared her bloodline. The silence of her death would protect the dignity of the Empress, for the scandal would never be spoken aloud. The earth itself would become her prison, her grave, and her erasure all at once. For the princess, there was no chance of appeal, no moment to plead her innocence. Perhaps she sensed it coming in the coldness of attendance, in the way ministers' gazes lingered upon her with veiled satisfaction. Perhaps she understood that her mother, though powerful, could not or would not intervene. Empress Suiko had built her reign upon precarious alliances, and to challenge those alliances for the sake of her daughter might have undone everything. Thus, the girl of 19 found herself condemned not by crime, but by convenience. She was not executed for what she had done, but for what she represented. A danger that could not be allowed to live. A silence that could not be allowed to linger. The cruelty of her fate lay in its invisibility. The world would not know that she had been sentenced. Her death would not be recorded. Her name would not be etched. She would simply vanish as though she had never existed. This was the true punishment, not death, but obliteration. In the darkened chambers of the palace, where orders were delivered with bowed heads and hushed voices, her life was signed away with no ink and no parchment. The decree was invisible, the sentence unwritten, yet its weight was undeniable. The walls themselves seemed to hold the knowledge of what was to come, the air heavy with the silence of complicity. It was a silence that echoed louder than any scream, for it was the silence of history itself closing over her, The night of her death was not marked by ceremony, but by secrecy. While the palace continued to glitter with lanterns and music in distant halls, a small procession wound its way through the shadows beyond the gates. At its center was the young daughter of Empress Suiko, her wrists bound, her steps faltering as attendants urged her forward. She was 19 years old, her face pale beneath the moonlight, her silence heavier than any cry. The world around her seemed to conspire in cruelty. The path led away from the golden screens of the palace, away from the chants of monks in the temples, away from every fragment of life she had known. Ahead lay the earth itself, freshly dug, a gaping wound in the soil. The hole waited like an open mouth, ready to devour her without resistance. Those who escorted her did not meet her eyes. Their duty was clear, their silence unbroken. To acknowledge her humanity would have been dangerous. To hesitate would have been fatal. And so they marched, eyes fixed ahead, ears deaf to the sound of her footsteps dragging across the gravel. When they reached the pit, she must have understood the truth fully, if she had not already. The chill of the earth rose up like breath from the underworld. Her body trembled. The whether from fear or cold, no one could say. She looked around, but there was no priest, no family, no ritual to sanctify her passing. There was only the pit, the darkness, and the hands that would bury her alive. Perhaps she cried then, or perhaps her fear left her too numb for tears. History does not tell us what her final moment sounded like. Yet it is not difficult to imagine the muffled sobs, the broken pleas, the desperate cries swallowed by the indifference of the night. For she was not executed as a criminal, she was discarded as an inconvenience, and inconveniences are not granted the dignity of witness. The first shovel of earth fell upon her, and the weight of it was more than physical. It was the sound of finality, the cruel punctuation to a life silenced before it could begin. She must have struggled. Her breath ragged as soil pressed against her chest, her arms clawing against the impossible weight. Each gasp would have grown shorter, sharper, as the earth tightened around her like a suffocating shroud. The night itself seemed to collude in erasure. The stars were hidden behind clouds. The wind carried no sound of protest. Her voice, if it rose, was muffled until it became indistinguishable from the sigh of the earth itself. By the time the pit was filled, silence reigned. Her body was gone, entombed not in stone or ritual, but in dirt and neglect. There was no marker left to mourn her. No incense burned for her soul. No name was inscribed in record. To those who buried her, she was already forgotten, her cries absorbed into the soil as though they had never been. Yet the ground where she lay remained heavy, as though holding within it the echo of a voice too young to have been silenced. That night, Asuka lost not only a daughter of its empress, but also a fragment of its conscience. The morning after her death, the palace stirred as it always did. Servants swept the corridors, courtiers prepared for audiences, monks recited sutras in the glow of incense. The sun rose upon Asuka as though nothing had occurred. The silence surrounding the young princess's fate was not negligence. It was deliberate. Her absence was not to be questioned, her name not to be spoken. Erasure became the strategy of survival. To speak of her was to acknowledge that injustice had been committed, and acknowledgement threatened the fragile balance of the court. So her name was unspoken, her memory unrecorded. The order that condemned her had not been written, and so history could pretend that no such crime had ever taken place. The soil that covered her body was matched by the silence that covered her story. This was the cruelty of power in its most refined form, not merely to kill, but to erase. Death alone does not destroy a person, for memory can keep them alive. But when memory itself is targeted, when silence is weaponized, the victim is annihilated twice, first in flesh, then in history. The courtiers continued their intrigues as if her existence had never troubled them. New alliances were forged, new decrees were issued, and the affairs of the state marched forward. Within this relentless machinery, she was nothing more than a missing breath, a space unacknowledged. Even those who had once pitied her dared not whisper her name. To do so was to risk being buried by the same silence. Her mother, Empress Suiko, bore the mask of composure. Whether she grieved in secret, history does not reveal. Perhaps the Empress allowed her daughter to be erased for the sake of preserving her throne, sacrificing personal sorrow for political survival. Perhaps she could do nothing at all, constrained by the factions that ruled her reign as much as she did. Whatever the truth, her silence joined the silence of the court, and together they became an impenetrable wall. For the people beyond the palace walls, the truth was never spoken directly. Yet whispers leaked, as whispers always do. Rumors of a princess buried alive spread in the villages, in the markets, in the songs of travelers. Though the chronicles omitted her, folk memory began to shape her into legend. But within the palace itself, her story was buried as surely as her body, sealed by deliberate neglect. In this, her death was not unique. History is filled with those who vanish between the lines of record, their lives deemed too inconvenient to preserve. Yet what makes her fate so haunting is the deliberate nature of her erasure. She was not forgotten by accident. She was erased by design. The Asuka court, with all its brilliance and reforms, chose silence as its cloak, leaving behind a gap that cannot be mended. The ground where she was buried became an unmarked grave of history itself. Each step taken above it was complicit in the silence. Each day that passed reinforced the lie that nothing had happened. And yet, even silence leaves traces. A gap in the chronicles is as loud as a scream to those who listen carefully. Her absence in the records is her testimony, her silence, her accusation. In the deliberate forgetting of one 19-year-old girl, the Asuka court revealed a truth it could not hide. That even in an age of enlightenment and reform, cruelty reigned with quiet precision. The silence of the palace did not erase the whispers of the land. Outside the walls of Asuka, in villages nestled among rice fields and forests, the story of the buried princess began to take root. It was not recorded in scrolls or etched in monuments, but carried in the breath of storytellers, murmured around firesides, whispered to children when the night was heavy with rain. They spoke of a young girl whose life was stolen by those who feared her, whose final cries were smothered not only by earth, but by the silence of the powerful. They said the soil that covered her was cursed, that each time the rains of summer came, water would seep red from the ground as though her blood still rose to the surface. Farmers avoided the place, and travelers passed it quickly, muttering prayers beneath their breath. In these tales, the princess became more than a forgotten child. She became a spirit, a shadow that lingered in the fields of Asuka. Some said they saw her figure at dusk, her robes torn, her face pale as she drifted between trees. Others claimed to hear the sound of muffled cries beneath the earth, as though the soil itself still remembered her breath. The people, powerless against the court, turned her suffering into warning. To them, she was a lesson whispered across generations, that power consumes even its own blood, that silence is a cruelty as sharp as any blade. Mothers cautioned their daughters with her name, though it was never written. reminding them that beauty and lineage could be as dangerous as curses. Legends say that in the heart of the rainy season, the ground where she lay would tremble, as if restless beneath its burden. When lightning split the sky, some claim to see her shadow in the flash, a fleeting reminder that the dead do not rest when injustice has sealed their fate. Whether truth or imagination, the persistence of these tales ensured that her story did not vanish completely. But within the palace, the silence endured. No official record acknowledged her. No inscription honored her. The contrast between the folk tales and the written history grew sharper with every passing year. It was as though two different worlds existed, one in which she had never lived, and one in which her ghost walked endlessly. This dissonance was the true curse she left behind. History tried to forget, but memory clung stubbornly to her absence. Silence had been meant to erase her, but instead, it gave rise to legend. And legends, once born, cannot be killed. They shift and change, but they endure, carried on lips long after ink fades from parchment. Her curse was not vengeance, but remembrance. By refusing to let her story vanish, the people gave her a kind of immortality, not the immortality of honor or triumph, but of sorrow, of injustice that festers through time. Every retelling of her tale was a condemnation of the court that buried her, a reminder that cruelty never remains hidden forever. Thus, the silence that was meant to destroy her became her voice. It echoed through generations, haunting the Asuka plain like the sound of rain against hollow earth. The forgotten daughter of Empress Suiko was only 19 when the earth swallowed her. Her name vanished from records, her voice was stifled, her story denied. Yet her silence became louder than any cry. Her fate reveals the fragility of women in the world of power, even when born of a sovereign. Her life was sacrificed to politics, her memory buried with intent. In the end, her tragedy lingers not in history's pages, but in the spaces where her name should have been. And in that silence, she remains, an eternal question carved into the soul of Asuka. How many other voices were buried, unheard beneath the weight of power?